Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, I want to share with you a story about survival, about the quiet, unyielding courage of a woman pushed beyond the edge of human endurance, and about the unexpected mercy that can find us in the darkest corners of the wilderness. It is a story set in the high, unforgiving territory of the American West, in a winter that old-timers in New Mexico would talk about for decades afterward. But more than that, it is a story about what happens to the human heart when everything you trusted is torn away, leaving you with nothing but your own breath, your own blood, and an unborn child who knows nothing of betrayal, knowing only that it is time to be born into a freezing world. If you have ever felt abandoned, if you have ever had to find strength in a room where the fire was dying and no one was coming to save you, then this story belongs to you. The winter of 1875 did not arrive gently in the Black Range. It came down like an iron hammer from the north, sweeping across the jagged limestone peaks of the Mogollon Rim and burying the high country under 4 feet of wind-packed, crystalline snow. By the second week of December, the temperature had plummeted so low that the ponderosa pines cracked like gunshot in the night, their sap freezing solid inside the bark. The wind was not merely a sound. It was a living, predatory beast, screaming down from the granite ridges, tearing through the canyon gorges, and throwing itself against the walls of an isolated, half-built homestead cabin sitting 8,000 feet above sea level. Inside that cabin, on a braided wool rug that was slowly soaking up the bitter frost from the pine floorboards, lay 24-year-old Elena Vance. She was on her hands and knees, her forehead pressed against the rough, splintered timber of the hearth, her body trembling with a violent, bone-deep shudder that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the white-hot agony tearing through her lower back. Her dark hair, damp with sweat and dusted with frost at the temples, clung to the hollows of her cheeks. Her fingers, red and stiff from the dropping temperature, dug into the crevices between the river stones of the fireplace, trying to find an anchor, any anchor, in a world that had suddenly dissolved into blinding pain and howling wind. The fire was dying. 2 hours ago, Elena had watched the last dry split of pinon pine collapse into a heap of glowing orange embers. She had known then that she needed to get up, needed to cross the 10 feet of freezing room to the woodbox beside the front door, and bring back enough fuel to keep the hearth alive through the night. But when she had tried to push herself up, the first true contraction had seized her, dropping her instantly back to her knees with the force of a physical blow. The child inside her, carried through 8 months of quiet hope and 11 days of sheer, suffocating terror, had decided that its time had arrived. It did not care that the storm outside had erased the tree line. It did not care that the chinking between the cabin logs was giving way to thin ribbons of drifting snow. It only knew the primal, unstoppable imperative of life. Now, as she looked at the fireplace through blurred, tear-stung eyes, only a faint bed of gray ash remained, glowing with a dull, dying pulse that offered no warmth against the sub-zero draft creeping up through the gaps in the floor. The cabin was losing its heat with terrifying speed. Every breath she took billowed in front of her face in thick, white clouds of steam. Her toes and fingertips had long since gone numb, replaced by that heavy, wooden ache that warns of freezing flesh. She was 24 years old, 8,000 feet up in the wilderness, 7 miles from the nearest frontier settlement, and she was entirely, utterly alone. As another contraction crested a grinding, rhythmic spasm that locked her muscles and stole the air from her lungs until she could only manage a muffled, ragged gasp against the stone, her mind betrayed her, dragging her back to the moment her world had ended. Not tonight in the storm, but 11 days ago, on a bright, deceptively still Tuesday morning. She remembered waking up that morning to an unnatural silence. In the 6 years she had been married to Caleb Vance, she had grown accustomed to the predictable morning cadence of their life together. The sharp scrape of his iron-toed boots against the floorboards, the metallic clatter of the coffee pot on the cast-iron stove, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting kindling out by the woodpile. Caleb had been a man of large gestures and restless energy, a handsome, golden-haired dreamer from Pennsylvania who had promised her an empire of timber and silver when he persuaded her to leave her family's modest farm along the Ohio River Valley. Elena had believed in those promises. She had packed her mother's hand-stitched quilts, her father's leather-bound books of poetry, and followed Caleb across 2,000 miles of prairie and dust, convincing herself that his restlessness was merely ambition, that his wandering eye was just curiosity, and that the hollow spaces in his promises would be filled once they finally built a home of their own. When they had filed their homestead claim high in the Mogollon foothills, she had worked alongside him until her hands were blistered and raw, hauling stones for the foundation, stripping cedar bark for the roof, and planting a garden in the rocky soil. And when she discovered in the late spring that she was carrying his child, she had wept with a profound, grateful relief, believing with all the innocent conviction of a young wife that a child would finally anchor Caleb's roaming heart to this soil. She had been wrong. On that Tuesday morning 11 days ago, she had pushed back the heavy quilts to find the cabin cold and the opposite side of the bed untouched. The air had smelled of nothing, no wood smoke, no boiling chicory, no human presence. She had pulled on her woolen shawl, her hands instinctively resting over the heavy, swollen mound of her belly, and walked barefoot into the kitchen. There, propped neatly against the blue ceramic salt jar on the rough-hewn pine table, was a folded piece of brown butcher paper. Elena remembered standing over that table, staring at the paper for a long, frozen minute before her hand had reached out to touch it. It was propped so casually, like an ordinary shopping list for the dry goods store in town, or a reminder to mend the south fence rail before the freeze. But when she unfolded it, she found only 4 lines written in Caleb's hurried, looping script, 4 lines that dismantled 6 years of devotion with the efficiency of a butcher's blade. Elena, I'm sorry. This mountain life isn't in me, and I won't rot waiting for silver that isn't here. Clara and I are leaving for California before the pass is close. Don't look for me. The homestead is yours. May God keep you, Caleb. She had read those words once, then twice, then a third time, very slowly, tracing each letter with the tip of her index finger, as if her mind were a foreign instrument, refusing to translate the simple English alphabet into reality. Clara. Clara was the red-haired saloon singer from the Silver City dance hall. The woman Caleb had claimed was merely the cousin of his mining partner, the woman he had sworn he only spoke to about land investments. Elena had not screamed. She had not fainted. The shock had settled into her bones with the cold, dense weight of lead. She had walked to the small floorboard beneath their bed, pulled it back, and found the tin canister empty. Every dollar they had saved for the winter, $72 earned from selling summer timber and handmade lace, was gone. She had walked out to the lean-to stable in the morning frost. The stall was open. The draft horse Barnaby was gone. The heavy winter saddle was gone, and with them, every realistic chance she had of traveling down the mountain before the December snows trapped the high country. He had left her 8 months pregnant, with half a sack of flour, a tub of salted lard, a dwindling pile of firewood, and no horse, knowing full well that the winter storms were only days away. He had not even possessed the decency to look into her eyes and watch her break. He had simply stolen her future in the dead of night and ridden west into the sun. Elena had folded that brown scrap of paper, placed it back against the blue salt jar, sat down by the cold hearth, and pressed both of her hands flat against her stomach. And there, in the crushing silence of the abandoned cabin, she had made a solemn, private vow to the child inside her. I will not cry. I will not waste a single drop of water or an ounce of strength on a ghost. We are going to live. For 11 days, she had kept that vow with a stubborn, ferocious dignity. She had rationed the dry beans and the salted pork, measuring out every meal with mathematical precision. When her back throbbed and her ankles swelled until she could barely lace her worn leather boots, she had dragged herself outside into the biting December wind, using a hand axe to chip fallen branches off the ponderosa pines near the cabin, hauling them inside one by one in the skirt of her dress. She had melted snow in an iron kettle to conserve her strength. And in the long, dark evenings, when the silence of the mountain pressed so heavily against the cabin walls that it felt like physical suffocating pressure, Elena had talked aloud to the child. She had told the baby about the soft green hills of Ohio, about the way the summer sun turned the clover sweet and heavy along the riverbanks, about the sound of rain on her father's barn roof, and about how they were going to build a life together, right here on this mountain, a life built on truth, on hard work, and on a love that did not run away when the wind turned cold. She had poured every memory of beauty and tenderness she possessed into the quiet air of the room, determined that her baby's first understanding of the world would not be fear, but the sound of its mother's steady, unbroken voice. She had managed. She had held the wilderness at bay with nothing more than her will. Until tonight. The storm had struck the Mogollon Rim at sunset with a fury unlike anything she had ever witnessed. Within 3 hours, the temperature had plummeted 40 degrees, and the snow was driving horizontally against the western wall of the cabin, packing itself into solid drifts that sealed the front door from the outside. And then, at the height of the gale, the child had begun its descent. Now, on the 11th night, the pain was no longer a wave. It was a deluge. It rose from the base of her spine like a white-hot current, radiating through her hips and seizing the muscles of her abdomen with an intensity so absolute, so violent, that it completely obliterated her ability to think. She collapsed forward, her cheek resting against the cold hearthstone, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. "Breathe, Elena," she whispered to herself through clenched teeth, her voice a ragged, shuddering thread in the dark. "Just breathe. Like the guide said, 10 counts in, 10 counts out. You can do this. You have to do this." She had read her mother's old domestic medicine handbook from cover to cover back in Ohio. She knew the sequence of labor. She knew that the pressure meant the baby was moving lower, that the transition was approaching. But medical handbooks assumed a warm bed, clean linen, boiling water on a roaring stove, and the comforting, experienced hands of a midwife like Martha Higgins to hold your shoulders and tell you when to push. They did not account for an isolated cabin where the water in the wash basin had already frozen into a solid sheet of ice. They did not account for a hearth that had dwindled to lifeless gray ash, or a freezing draft that blew through the floorboards like knives slicing through her skirts. Elena tried to push herself up onto her knees once more, determined to crawl toward the woodbox. She made it 2 feet across the braided rug before another contraction ripped through her, so savage and prolonged that her arms buckled beneath her weight. She struck the floor, gasping for air, her fingernails clawing at the pine boards as she fought the urge to scream. There was no point in screaming. The nearest neighbor was old Reverend Stokes, 4 miles south down the creek bed, a man who was nearly deaf and whose only mule had died 2 months ago. The town of San Rafael was 7 miles east through the canyon pass, a distance that might as well have been 1,000 miles in a blizzard that had wiped out every trail and road. No one knew she was in labor. No one in the territory knew Caleb had left her, except the saloon keepers who didn't care. No one was looking toward the high ridge tonight. She was alone at the edge of the world, suspended between life and death in a frozen room. The cold was settling into her chest now, thick and heavy. Elena rolled onto her side, curling her trembling body around the hard, sacred swell of her stomach, trying to shield her unborn baby with the last reserves of her own body heat. She could feel the child moving fiercely, struggling against the tight walls of her womb, fighting to enter a world that was currently offering it only darkness and freezing air. Tears, hot, bitter, and uncontrollable, finally broke past her defenses, spilling over her eyelashes and freezing instantly against the high bones of her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, softly into the dark, her voice breaking against the howling of the wind outside. "I'm so sorry, little one. I tried. God knows I tried to keep the fire going. I tried to hold on for you." The cabin shook violently as a massive gust slammed into the eaves, groaning under the strain of the blizzard. Elena closed her eyes, her strength entirely spent, her body surrendering to the overwhelming exhaustion that followed the contraction. The darkness began to close in around the edges of her vision, not like sleep, but like the quiet, velvet descent of the end. And then, cutting through the roar of the gale, through the shuddering of the timber walls, and through the haze of her fading consciousness, she heard it. It was not the wind. It was not the heavy pine branches groaning under the weight of the snow, nor the sound of the cabin settling in the frost. It was the distinct, deliberate crunch of heavy footsteps in the deep drift outside the threshold. Elena's eyes flew open. Every nerve in her body snapped taut with a sudden, electrifying surge of adrenaline. She held her breath, listening through the freezing gloom. Outside the heavy cedar door, something or someone had stopped. And in that fraction of a second, the wild, chaotic violence of the blizzard seemed to pull back, replaced by a different kind of silence altogether. A heavy, breathless silence, filled with an undeniable presence. She did not have the strength to stand. She did not have the strength to reach for the rusty iron fire poker by the hearth. She could only lie on the frozen floor, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, watching the iron latch of the cabin door as it slowly, deliberately, began to lift. His name among the white traders and frontier soldiers was Silas Blackwood, but in the canyon strongholds of the Black Range, where the red rock met the sky, he was known to his people as Taza, a son of the Chihen, the red paint people of the Warm Springs Apache. For 6 grueling days and nights, Taza had been moving through the high country alone. He moved not like a man braving the winter, but like a shadow woven directly from the granite, the scrub oak, and the falling snow. He was 28 winters old, his tall, lean frame hardened by a lifetime of mountain travel, his muscles carved by the relentless demands of a land that showed no mercy to the weak. Beneath his heavy, fleece-lined canvas capote and the fringed buckskin hunting shirt he wore beneath it, his body was a masterclass in controlled endurance. On his feet were high, knee-length Apache moccasins, crafted from thick rawhide with upturned toe shields designed to deflect the jagged cactus and sharp shale of the New Mexico mountains. He had been traveling south from the high northern plateaus, where he had spent weeks scouting, hunting trails, and monitoring the movements of the military outposts near the Rio Grande. His destination was the deep, sheltered canyon country south of the Mogollon Rim, the winter sanctuary where his clan, the Warm Springs Band, he had set up their winter camp along the warm geothermal creeks beneath the sheltering limestone cliffs. He was carrying little: a Springfield carbine slung across his broad shoulder in a waterproof deerskin case, a bone-handled hunting knife sheathed at his hip, a rawhide pouch of dried venison pounded with crushed chokecherries, and a canteen wrapped in wool to keep the water from turning to solid ice. He was traveling during the height of the blizzard for a reason that every warrior of his band understood with instinctive clarity. The storm was his greatest protection. In the winter of 1875, the New Mexico Territory was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The United States Cavalry, operating out of Fort Bayard and Fort Craig, had doubled their patrols through the foothills, driven by territorial politicians and land speculators who were desperate to clear the Apache from their ancestral mineral-rich mountains once and for all. To the white settlers flooding into the mining camps of Silver City and the farming settlements of the valleys, an Apache man found outside the designated agency boundaries was not viewed as a human being. He was treated as an immediate threat, fair game for any vigilante posse, scalp hunter, or trigger-happy rancher with a Winchester rifle. Taza knew the rules of this unforgiving borderland. He spoke serviceable English, learned through years of tense negotiations with frontier traders, and he spoke Spanish with the fluid grace of the border country. But he harbored no illusions about what his presence meant on this side of the mountain. If he were spotted by a cavalry detachment or a group of freighters, there would be no questions, no explanations, and no trial. There would only be the crack of a rifle or the rough hemp of a hangman's rope thrown over the limb of a cottonwood tree. And so, Taza traveled as his grandfather had taught him, through the teeth of the gale. When the white soldiers retreated into their warm barracks, huddled around iron stoves with card decks and whiskey, Taza walked the high ridges. He stepped only on windswept granite and frozen shale where his rawhide soles left no tracks. He moved along the windward face of the peaks where the driving snow erased his passage within minutes. His lungs, accustomed to the thin, freezing air of 8,000 feet, took in the mountain cold with steady, measured breaths that never broke his rhythm. He was 3 days away from the warmth of his people's lodge fires. He had every reason in the world to keep his head down, pull the fur collar of his coat tight against his throat, and let the mountains swallow him whole. And then, the mountain spoke to him in a way he had not anticipated. It began with a scent. Taza stopped dead in his tracks, along the spine of a limestone ridge, the wind howling around him like a pack of starving wolves. To an untrained man, the storm carried only the scent of frozen water, pine needles, and ozone. But Taza's senses had been honed since childhood to read the invisible currents of the air with the precision of an eagle. Beneath the biting chill, a faint, erratic thread of wood smoke brushed against his nostrils. It was piñon pine, but it was not the thick, vigorous smoke of a well-tended hearth. It was thin, dying, smelling of cold ash and smoldering embers, the scent of a fire that was losing its battle against the frost. Taza turned his face slightly into the gale, his dark, obsidian eyes narrowing against the stinging crystals of ice. The smoke was coming from a shallow draw 200 yards below the ridgeline, tucked behind a stand of old-growth ponderosas, where he knew a white settler had cleared a small patch of land the previous spring. His first instinct was the instinct of a seasoned warrior. Turn away. Keep to the high timber. A settler's chimney is none of your business. He took one step forward along the ridge, intending to bypass the draw entirely. But before his foot could touch the snow, a sound carried up from the hollow below, a sound that cut through the roar of the blizzard like a sharp blade slicing through heavy wool. It was a cry. It was not the high screaming challenge of a mountain lion, nor was it the mournful groan of a frozen pine branch giving way under the weight of the snow. It was unmistakably human. It was a woman's voice, ragged, broken open, and saturated with an agony so absolute that it seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. Taza froze. The snow swirled around his motionless figure, piling against the buckskin fringe of his coat, but he did not move a muscle. He stood on the edge of the granite drop, listening with every fiber of his being. 10 seconds passed, then 20, and then the sound rose again, a low, breathless moan of sheer exhaustion and terror, ending in a desperate, choked gasp that died beneath the shrieking wind. A violent war erupted inside Taza's chest. His mind, sharpened by years of hard-earned caution, laid out the brutal truth of the situation. You are an Apache man alone in the Black Range. The soldiers are patrolling the passes below. If you step off this ridge and walk down into that clearing, you are walking directly into the lion's mouth. If there is a white man in that cabin with a rifle, he will shoot you through the door without a second thought. If the woman is dying, her people will claim you killed her. You have 3 days of travel ahead. You have a clan waiting for you. Turn your back and walk. It was the rational choice. It was the choice that would guarantee his survival. Yet, as he stood there in the freezing dark, his hand resting on the icy leather of his carbine sling, a memory rose from the depths of his past, a memory so sharp and painful that time had done nothing to dull its edge. 6 winters ago, when Taza was a young warrior of 22, a surprise cavalry sweep had scattered his band across the frozen foothills of the Mimbres River. The men had scattered in pairs to draw the soldiers away from the women and children, who had retreated into the damp, freezing limestone caves high above the canyon floor. Among those hiding in the dark was Taza's younger sister, a gentle, bright-eyed girl of 15 named Little Sparrow. For 4 days, the warriors had fought a running skirmish through the snow, leading the cavalry on a wild, exhausting chase across 40 miles of rugged country before finally losing them in the desert washes. When Taza had finally returned to the hidden caves, triumphant and alive, he had found his mother weeping by a cold stone ledge. A brutal winter lung fever had struck the cave during the second night. With no firewood, no hot water, and no medicine men able to reach them through the military cordon, Little Sparrow's fever had burned uncontrolled. She had died in the freezing dark on a bed of dry pine boughs, her small hand reaching out for a brother who was miles away playing war with soldiers. Taza had held her cold, lifeless body against his chest for hours in the cave, weeping tears that froze into beads of ice against her buckskin dress. He had buried her beneath a cairn of red mountain stones, and on that day he had sworn an oath to the Creator, to Usan, the giver of life, that he would never again turn his back on the sacred spark of human breath, no matter whose body carried it. In the Apache way, life was not cheap. It was not divided by the petty hatreds of men or the violent borders drawn on government maps. The Creator placed human beings on the earth to walk in Goshu in beauty, in honor, and in balance with all living things. To hear a woman dying alone in a frozen storm and walk away to save his own skin would not make him a wise warrior. It would make him a coward. It would mean that his sister had died for nothing, and that the blood in his veins had turned to cold mountain water. Taza closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the bitter wind sting his face. "Forgive me, my sister," he murmured in his native tongue, his deep voice swallowed by the blizzard. "I cannot keep walking." He did not hesitate again. Taza turned his boots away from the safe high trail and began his descent down the steep, snow-choked slope into the draw. He moved with swift, calculated grace, stepping from the cover of one massive ponderosa pine to the next, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the clearing below with lethal awareness. As he broke through the tree line, the homestead revealed itself in all its grim, tragic reality. It was a small, roughly built cabin of hewn pine logs, its roof sagging slightly beneath the heavy burden of snow. But it was the signs of abandonment that caught his eye immediately. There were no fresh horse tracks anywhere in the yard. The lean-to stable stood open, its stall empty, filled with drifting powder. There was no firewood stacked against the exterior wall beneath the eaves, only a few broken branches scattered near the threshold. The snow drifted up against the heavy cedar door, undisturbed by foot or shovel, reaching almost to the iron latch. There was no man here. There had been no man here for days. Taza approached the cabin from the blind angle of the chimney, his hand instinctively resting on the cold steel receiver of his Springfield carbine. He stepped onto the small, snow-covered porch, his moccasins making no more sound than falling pine needles. He leaned his ear against the thick timber door, holding his breath to listen past the howling of the storm. From inside came the sound of a ragged, shuddering intake of air, followed by a soft, broken sob. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, little one. I tried. God knows I tried to keep the fire going." The words were English, spoken in the soft, melodic cadence of an eastern valley, but the terror in them needed no translation. It was the sound of a soul standing at the edge of the abyss, looking down into the cold dark. Taza did not knock. In a storm that could freeze a man's blood in minutes, courtesy was a luxury that neither of them could afford. He reached out his gloved hand, wrapped his long fingers around the frozen iron latch, and lifted it. The latch clicked a sharp metallic snap that seemed to echo inside the silent room. Taza leaned his shoulder into the heavy cedar planks, applying steady, deliberate pressure against the snow packed against the outside base. With a low groan of rusted iron hinges, the door swung inward. A violent gust of wind seized the opening, driving a swirling vortex of white snow and freezing air across the threshold into the dark interior of the cabin. Taza stepped across the threshold and paused, framing his tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the gray, howling tempest behind him. He immediately reached back, gripped the heavy door handle, and pulled it firmly shut against the blizzard, throwing his weight against the wood until the iron latch dropped back into its slot with a solid, echoing thud. The sudden silence inside the room was deafening. Taza stood with his back to the door, his dark eyes instantly adjusting to the dim, amber gloom. He took in the entire scene in a single, comprehensive sweep, the disciplined evaluation of a scout entering unknown territory. The air inside was scarcely warmer than the gale outside. In the massive stone fireplace across the room, the hearth was nearly dead, reduced to a faint, pulsing glow of gray ash that cast long, shivering shadows across the pine floorboards. There was no lamplit, no kettle boiling, no comfort anywhere in the room. And there, on the braided rag rug at the foot of the cold hearth, lay Elena Vance. She had pushed herself onto her side, propped up on one trembling elbow. Her dark hair was plastered to her sweat-sheened forehead, her wool skirts twisted around her legs, her chest heaving as she fought for every breath. Her face, illuminated by the dying embers, was pale as bone, her features etched with an exhaustion so profound that it looked like grief carved in marble. As the door had slammed shut, Elena's head had whipped around. Her wide, fever-bright hazel eyes locked onto his, widening in an instant of pure, paralyzing shock. What she saw was the very embodiment of every terrifying tale whispered around frontier campfires. A towering Apache warrior standing inside her home, cloaked in wolfskin and falling snow, holding a military rifle, with the raw, untamed power of the wilderness clinging to his shoulders like a mantle. For 3 long, breathless seconds, neither of them moved. The only sound in the frozen room was the frantic, shallow rhythm of Elena's breathing and the muffled howling of the blizzard beating uselessly against the cedar logs. Taza saw the terror flare in her eyes, a wild, cornered panic that threatened to shatter whatever strength she had left. He saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the fabric of her skirt, trying desperately to pull herself backward toward the stone hearth, her body instinctively attempting to shield the massive, sacred curve of her pregnant belly. Taza did not step forward. He did not raise his weapon. Slowly, With a deliberate, calm grace designed to telegraph peace, he unslung the Springfield carbine from his shoulder and set it down against the wall beside the door, completely out of his reach. He unbuckled his heavy hunting knife and laid it across the rifle stock. Then, he reached up with both hands, pushed back the heavy fur hood of his capote, revealing his high cheekbones, his strong, weathered jaw, and the long, straight black hair that fell past his broad shoulders. He took one slow, measured step into the center of the room, keeping his empty hands open, palms facing outward at the level of his chest. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly deep, rich, and steady, a voice that carried the quiet, grounded resonance of earth and stone, cutting through the frozen silence with absolute clarity. "I am not going to hurt you," he said in plain, clear English. Elena stared up at him from the frozen floor. The terror in her eyes did not vanish. It was too deep, too justified by everything the world had taught her. But as she looked into the steady, calm depths of his dark eyes, something in her wild panic began to fracture. She saw no cruelty in the lines of his face. She saw no mockery, no malice, and no hesitation. What she saw in the eyes of the stranger standing over her was something she had not seen in Caleb's eyes for years. An unshakable, profound presence. A man who had looked upon death and refused to bow to it. Another contraction struck her without warning. A sharp, agonized gasp tore from Elena's throat as her back arched, her hands instantly flying to her stomach as her body folded forward in a desperate, violent spasm. The pain stripped away the last remnants of her fear, stripped away the borders between nations and races, stripped away everything except the brutal, urgent reality of survival. She looked up at him through clenched teeth, her vision swimming with tears of agony, her voice coming out in a ragged, breathless plea that carried all the remaining strength of her soul. "The fire," she choked out, her trembling hand pointing weakly toward the gray ashes of the hearth. "The fire. Please." Taza did not say another word. He dropped to his knees beside the cold hearth, pulled the buckskin gloves from his hands, and went to work. When a man has lived his entire life in the high mountains, where a single miscalculation can mean freezing to death before the sun rises, he learns to treat fire not as a mere tool, but as a living spirit, a sacred presence that demands reverence, patience, and absolute focus. Taza knelt before the cold hearth of the Vance cabin, his broad knees resting directly on the icy pine floorboards. He did not look around the room again. He did not ask Elena any more questions. He understood, with every instinct in his blood, that words were useless currency against the encroaching frost, and that the only thing standing between this woman, her unborn child, and the silent sleep of death was the speed of his own hands. From a small rawhide pouch at his waist, he produced a tight bundle of shredded cedar bark and dried pitch pine shavings that he always carried close to his body to keep dry. With swift, practiced motions, he swept away the crust of gray ash in the center of the hearth with the edge of his hand, exposing the faint, sluggish pulse of red heat slumbering beneath. He placed the tinder gently over the embers, leaned down until his cheek nearly touched the stone, and began to blow. His breath was slow, steady, and warm, a measured stream of air that coaxed the dormant spark. For 2 agonizing seconds, there was only a thin plume of pale smoke. Then, with a soft, hungry crackle, the resin in the cedar shavings caught. A bright yellow tongue of flame leaped upward, illuminating the angular planes of Taza's face, casting dancing amber shadows across his dark eyes and the straight black hair that fell across his shoulders. He did not wait for the kindling to burn down. Moving with an economy of motion that looked like a quiet dance, he reached for the dry split logs stacked in the corner of the room, adding thin sticks of pine first, then heavier wedges of cured oak. Within 3 minutes, the hearth was roaring. The sharp, clean scent of burning pitch and sweet cedar pushed into the freezing gloom, driving back the bitter dampness that had settled into the logs. Behind him, on the floor, Elena let out a long, shuddering breath. It was not relief. Her body was far too deep in the crucible of labor for relief, but it was that first, instinctive release of tension that happens when a freezing creature feels the first wave of radiant heat touch its skin. The heavy amber glow of the fire rolled across the floorboards like a rising tide, washing over her pale face, softening the harsh shadows under her cheekbones, and turning the frost on her eyelashes into glittering beads of water. Taza turned from the fire and looked at her. He did not look at her as a white settler, might look upon an abandoned woman with pity or condescension. He looked at her with the quiet, assessing gravity of a scout who recognized a fellow traveler fighting for her life in a storm. He saw the violent trembling in her limbs, the white-knuckled grip she had on the edges of her skirts, and the deep, hollow strain around her mouth. She had been holding her breath against both the cold and the pain for hours, rationing her strength until she was down to the raw marrow of her spirit. "Lie back," he said softly, his English smooth and low, carrying a deep, calming resonance that seemed to steady the frantic vibration of the room. "The stone will warm now. Rest your back toward the hearth." Elena did not argue. She lacked the strength for pride or hesitation. With a soft, pained whimper, she allowed herself to roll back against the hearthstone, letting the rising heat of the rock seep through the damp woolen layers of her dress into her aching spine. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide and glassy with fever, tracking his every movement as he rose to his feet. Taza moved around the small cabin with purposeful, silent strides. He found Caleb's heavy iron kettle sitting empty on the dry sink, its interior dry and rusted. Without a word, he unlatched the front door just enough to scoop 2 heavy loads of clean, wind-drifted snow from the porch into the pot, pulled the door shut against the howling gale, and hung the kettle directly over the roaring flames on the iron crane. He searched the small, open pantry until he found what he was looking for: a clean stack of white cotton flannels that Elena had washed and folded weeks ago in anticipation of a very different kind of birth, and a tin of tallow candles. He lit 2 of the candles, placing them on the mantelpiece so the light fell evenly across the room, without shining directly into her eyes. Then, he took Caleb's heavy winter hunting knife from where he had left it by the door, wiped the blade clean, and placed it on the hearth beside a spool of boiled linen thread. As he knelt beside her once more, Taza caught the faint, unmistakable scent of copper in the air, the primal scent of blood and amniotic fluid that marks the boundary between the world of the unborn and the world of the living. He knew that time had narrowed to a razor's edge. Elena's hand suddenly shot out across the rag rug. Her trembling, ice-cold fingers clamped onto the thick buckskin sleeve of his forearm with a strength that was startling in its desperation. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark, brain-tanned leather of his coat. Her back arched off the floor as another contraction seized her, a contraction so violent and prolonged that her breath caught in her throat in a sharp, strangling gasp. Her eyes locked onto his, wild with the sudden, overwhelming terror of a woman realizing that she is about to be split in 2 and that there is no turning back. "Have you?" Elena choked out through clenched teeth, her chest heaving as she fought to draw air into her lungs. "Have you ever done this? Do you know what to do?" The question hung in the warm, firelit air between them, heavy with all the fragile vulnerability of her life. Taza did not look away. He did not lie to her to offer false comfort, nor did he look down in shame. He looked directly into her fever-bright eyes with a steady, unblinking honesty that was more reassuring than any hollow promise could ever have been. "I have seen the calves come in the spring," he said plainly, his voice measured and quiet. "And 2 winters ago I stood outside the lodge when my cousin gave life to her son. I heard the women speak of it. But this is women's medicine, and I am a hunter. I will not pretend to know what only a mother knows." A quiet, terrified sob broke from Elena's lips at his words, her fingers digging even deeper into his arm, until he could feel the sharp bite of her nails through the leather. She felt the vast, terrifying abyss opening beneath her once more. No doctor, no midwife, only an Apache warrior who had never delivered a child. Taza reached out with his free hand. Slowly, with deliberate gentleness, he placed his broad, warm palm over the back of her trembling hand, covering her white knuckles with the steady, grounding heat of his own skin. "Listen to me," he said, leaning closer so that she could feel the calm warmth of his breath against her cheek. "I do not know the medicine of your doctors, but I have 2 hands that do not shake in the dark. I have walked through the storm to this hearth, and I will not leave you to face this night alone. We will do this together, you and I." The certainty in his voice did something extraordinary to the room. It did not take away the agony tearing through her pelvis, nor did it silence the howling of the blizzard outside. But it built an invisible wall around them, a fortress of shared resolve that shut out the cold, the fear, and the bitter memory of the man who had abandoned her. Elena looked at his face, really looking at him in the amber glow of the fire. She saw the quiet nobility in his dark eyes, the deep lines of patience carved into his brow, and the absolute absence of fear. In that fleeting second, she realized that this stranger cared more for the survival of her child than her own husband ever had. "Hot water," she whispered, her voice breaking as the contraction finally began to release its grip, leaving her limp and gasping against the stone. "And stay. Please, Silas. Just stay." "I am here," he replied softly. "I am not going anywhere." What followed over the next 5 hours was a journey into the deepest, most primal territory of the human spirit, a night of fire, blood, and quiet communion that would forever redefine the boundaries of who they were. Outside, the storm reached its terrifying zenith. The wind shrieked through the canyon passes like 1,000 screaming souls, throwing heavy sheets of sleet against the cedar shake roof, rattling the cabin logs with an intensity that made the iron pots on the pantry shelves clatter. But inside the circle of firelight, the world shrank to the space of a few square feet of braided rug. As the midnight hour passed, Elena entered the dark, disorienting fog of transitional labor. The contractions were no longer rhythmic waves with gentle valleys of rest. They were a continuous, relentless torrent that gave her no time to breathe, no time to recover, and no time to think. Her body was consumed by an ancient, terrifying power that shook her frame from her temples to her toes. She became feverish, her head thrashing against the folded wool blanket Taza had placed beneath her. Memories of her betrayal surged to the surface in broken, fevered fragments. She began to mutter Caleb's name, her voice thick with weeping, pleading with a ghost who was 100 miles away in a warm saloon. She spoke of the 4-line letter, she spoke of the salt jar, she spoke of the cold winter savings stolen in the night. The grief that she had locked away so ruthlessly for 11 days broke through its dam, spilling out in raw, ragged confessions that filled the firelit room. Taza did not interrupt her. He did not tell her to be quiet. He knelt beside her hour after hour, his long legs folded under him, his back straight, absorbing the weight of her sorrow with the patient endurance of a mountain. Whenever she called out in distress, he dipped a clean flannel into the steaming kettle of water, wrung it out with his strong hands, and gently pressed the warm, soothing cloth to her forehead, her burning cheeks, and the tense muscles of her neck. He wiped the sweat from her eyes. He held a tin cup of warm water to her cracked lips, patiently encouraging her to take small, steady sips between the spasms. When the chills racked her body, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably, he pulled his own heavy, fleece-lined wool capote from his shoulders and draped it over her trembling torso, tucking the edges securely around her shoulders. And through it all, whenever the pain threatened to drown her completely, Elena's hand found his. She held onto his left forearm as if it were the only solid object in a world that had dissolved into chaos. She gripped him so fiercely that her fingers went numb, pulling his arm against her chest, burying her face into the sleeve of his shirt to stifle her screams. Taza never pulled away. He never flinched. When the pain reached its absolute peak and her body bowed off the floor in agony, he would lean forward, placing his right hand firmly behind her shoulders to support her spine, bringing his face close to hers. "Breathe, Elena," he would command in that deep, steady baritone that seemed to bypass her panic and speak directly to her blood. "Do not fight the mountain. Ride the wave. Look at me. Look into my eyes." And Elena would open her tear-filled eyes, finding his dark, unwavering gaze in the firelight. She anchored herself to him. In the depths of his dark eyes, she saw no judgment, no disgust at her vulnerability, and no hesitation. She saw only an endless reservoir of strength, a steady, unyielding rock against which she could break her pain without fear of falling. Their breathing began to synchronize in the quiet intervals between contractions. Taza would inhale deeply, deliberately, and Elena, watching his chest rise beneath the buckskin, would follow his rhythm, drawing the warm, cedar-scented air deep into her lungs, exhaling slowly as the spasm receded. In those quiet, suspended moments in the middle of the night, with the fire crackling softly and their hands locked together in a grip of iron, something profound and nameless passed between them. It was an intimacy born not of romance or desire, but of the raw, sacred truth of shared mortality. They were two human beings, stripped of every social pretense, every racial barrier, and every historical grudge, bound together by the primal struggle to bring a new life into the light. As the third hour of the morning approached, Taza felt a change in the cadence of her body. The contractions shifted from the long, grinding aches of the back to the sudden, uncontrollable downward bearing of the final stage. Elena let out a sharp, guttural cry that was entirely different from the cries that had come before, a sound that was ancient, wild, and commanding. It's coming, she gasped, her knuckles turning white as she pulled herself upward, her eyes wide with shock. Silas. Oh God, Silas, it's coming now. Taza's heart struck hard against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of absolute calm. He moved with swift, disciplined precision. He folded several clean flannels between her knees, rolled up the sleeves of his buckskin shirt past his elbows, and washed his hands thoroughly in the steaming water from the kettle. He knelt directly between her feet, his dark eyes focused and reverent. I am here, Elena, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that cut through her mounting panic. I am right here. The time has come to push. Do not hold back. Give the child your strength. Elena closed her eyes, threw her head back against the stone hearth, and pushed. The pain was beyond anything she had ever conceived, a white, blinding explosion of pressure that seemed to tear her soul from her flesh. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the cedar logs, her hands clawing desperately at the wool blanket beneath her. Again, Taza urged, his voice steady, his large, warm hands gently and carefully guiding the descent. You have the strength of the mountain in you, Elena. Push. She drew in a desperate lungful of air and pushed again, pouring every ounce of her remaining life, every shred of her mother's love, and every defiance of her 11 days of abandonment into that single, supreme effort. Outside the cabin, the high country storm began to break. The shrieking winds slowly subsided to a low, mournful sigh through the ponderosa pines, and along the eastern horizon, the first faint line of dawn began to bleed across the jagged peaks of the Black Range, a pale, crystalline gray that slowly turned to amber and rose. And inside the warm, firelit room, at the exact moment the first ray of morning light struck the frosted windowpane, the miracle occurred. With a final, triumphant cry that emptied Elena's lungs completely, the child slipped into Taza's waiting hands. A profound, breathless stillness fell over the cabin. For 2 terrifying seconds, the only sound was the soft crackle of the oak log in the hearth and the ragged, shallow panting of the exhausted mother on the floor. Taza held the tiny, slippery creature in his large, scarred hands with a reverence so overwhelming that his own breath caught in his throat. He saw the dark, wet curls of hair plastered to the tiny scalp, the perfectly formed fingers and toes, and the fragile perfection of the little chest. Gently, with the utmost care, he cleared the baby's mouth and nose with the edge of a warm, clean flannel, turned the child slightly, and rubbed her back with a firm, circular motion. The baby drew in her first breath of cold mountain air. And then, she cried. It was not a weak whimper. It was a furious, magnificent, full-throated wail that shattered the morning silence, a fierce, defiant proclamation that cut through the memories of the blizzard, through the pain, and through the loneliness, announcing to the Mogollon Range that she had arrived and that she was alive. On the floor, Elena heard that cry. A sound broke from her chest that was half sob, half laugh, the most broken, open, exquisitely beautiful sound a human voice could produce. Tears poured freely down her sweat-streaked cheeks as her trembling arms reached out blindly toward the hearth. Is she? Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the baby's indignant wails. Is she whole? Is she alive? Taza looked down at the child, and for the first time since he had stepped across the threshold, a soft, radiant smile broke across his weathered face. She is a warrior, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. She is strong, and she is whole. Working quickly to protect the newborn from the morning chill, Taza used the boiled linen thread to tie the umbilical cord with careful, double knots, severing it cleanly with the sharp, heated blade of his hunting knife. He dried the baby's damp skin with warm flannel, clearing away the blood and vernix with the gentleness of a father. Then, he took his own heavy, fleece-lined wool capote, the coat that had carried him through 6 days of mountain blizzards, the coat that still held the clean scent of pine smoke and the warmth of his own body, and wrapped it snugly around the tiny girl, creating a thick, protective nest of wool and sheepskin. He leaned forward on his knees and placed the bundle gently into Elena's waiting arms. As the baby was laid against her bare chest, skin to skin, Elena let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to release every terror, every heartbreak, and every sorrow she had carried since Caleb had ridden away. She pulled the edges of the heavy coat around her daughter, looking down into the tiny, red, scowling face with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration that lit her exhausted features from within. Taza sat back on his heels, resting his forearms across his knees, and watched them. The morning light was streaming through the eastern window now, cutting through the swirling dust motes in long, golden shafts of winter sun, mingling with the deep amber glow of the fire. It illuminated the mother and child in a circle of sacred warmth. Taza felt something vast, quiet, and entirely unexpected move through the center of his chest. He had spent his life surrounded by war, by the threat of cavalry carbines, by the constant, exhausting struggle to keep his people alive against impossible odds. He had seen men die in the rocks. He had seen his sister slip away in the cold. He had never witnessed the arrival of life. To see this tiny, fierce spirit cross the threshold from the spirit world into the light, and to know that his own hands had caught her, left him completely undone. A profound, sacred stillness settled over his spirit, a feeling that the Creator had guided his moccasins through the blizzard not merely to save a stranger, but to show him the true meaning of the breath inside his own lungs. Elena looked up from the baby's face, her hazel eyes meeting his across the small space of the rag rug. Her face was utterly destroyed with exhaustion, her skin pale, her hair wild and tangled, dark circles carved beneath her eyes, yet she looked to him like the most magnificent thing the earth had ever created. "Thank you," she whispered. The two words were soft, barely carrying past the crackle of the wood, but they carried the entire weight of her soul. Taza swallowed the tightness in his throat and nodded slowly. He did not trust his voice to speak. Elena looked back down at the baby, who had finally quieted, soothed by the rhythmic beating of her mother's heart and the deep warmth of the fleece coat. The tiny girl opened one dark, unfocused eye, looking up toward the light of the fire. "What is your name?" Elena asked softly, without looking up. "I know only what you told me at the door. Among my people, I am called Taza," he replied, in a low, gentle voice. "The white men call me Silas Blackwood." Elena repeated the names quietly, letting them linger in the air like a prayer. "Taza, Silas." She lifted her gaze back to his. "I am Elena, and this is who we fought for." Silas looked at the tiny bundle in her arms, his dark eyes softening with an ancient, tender reverence. "Does she have a name?" he asked. Elena looked down at the dark curls of hair, then reached out with one finger to gently stroke the soft curve of her daughter's cheek. She thought of the letter on the salt jar, of the red-haired singer Caleb had run away with, and how she had once thought that name was poisoned forever. But as she looked at her baby's fierce, unbroken spirit, she realized that no coward could ever steal the beauty from a name that belonged to life. "Her name is Clara," Elena said, her voice clear, certain, and ringing with quiet pride. "Her name is Clara, and she is going to live." Silas tested the name aloud, his deep voice rolling over the syllables with a soft, melodic dignity. "Clara, it is a good name. It sounds like the mountain water after the snow melts." He looked at Elena, and for a long, breathless moment, their gazes held in the golden morning light. The silence that filled the cabin was no longer the silence of abandonment or fear. It was the rich, pregnant silence of a new beginning, a silence that held the quiet, unspoken promise of two souls who had met at the edge of the world and had chosen to stand together. The morning that followed the great storm broke over the Black Range with a brilliance that seemed almost blinding in its purity. Through the small, four-panned eastern window of the cabin, the high-altitude sun climbed above the jagged crest of the mountains, sending long, crystalline shafts of rose and amber light slicing through the cold room. Outside, the world was blanketed in a pristine, unbroken sea of white, but inside the small circle of the hearth, the air was warm, with the scent of burning piñon pine, melted snow, and the clean, sweet fragrance of a newborn child. Silas remained kneeling on the braided rug beside Elena. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The violent struggle of the night had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep, so sacred, that to break it with ordinary words felt like a disturbance of something holy. Elena was propped against the bed of folded quilts Silas had arranged for her against the warm stone base of the fireplace. Her dark hair fell in damp, tangled waves over her shoulders, and her face was still pale from the ordeal of labor, but her hazel eyes were bright with a quiet, luminous wonder. In the crook of her arm, wrapped securely in the heavy wool and fleece of Silas's winter capote, baby Clara slept with her tiny fists curled against her chin, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper that matched the crackle of the embers. Slowly, as if moving through water, Silas reached his hand across the space between them. His hand was large, his skin darkened by years under the fierce southwestern sun, his knuckles scarred from hard labor and the rough realities of the frontier. Yet, as he extended his long index finger toward the sleeping child, his touch was as light as a falling feather. With breathtaking gentleness, the hardened Apache warrior brushed the soft, warm curve of Clara's cheek. The contrast was staggering, the ancient, weathered strength of a mountain man meeting the tender, petal-soft fragility of a creature only minutes old. Clara stirred slightly at the warmth of his skin, nuzzling her tiny nose against his finger, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Elena watched him, and something deep within her guarded heart, a wall of ice she had built to protect herself from the world, began to crack. She remembered Caleb. She remembered the 6 years she had spent trying to coax warmth from a man whose soul was made of sand and wind. Whenever she had spoken of children back in Ohio, Caleb had frowned, speaking only of the expense, the burden, the way a family would tie him down when silver was waiting to be dug in the western hills. He had never looked at her with reverence. He had looked at her as an accessory to his wandering ambitions. Yet here, sitting on the floor of an abandoned cabin, was a stranger, a man her people had taught her to fear, a man who owed her nothing, looking upon her newborn daughter with tears glistening in the corners of his dark eyes, treating this fragile new life as a sacred gift from the Creator. Silas slowly drew his hand back, resting his forearm across his knee. He looked up, his dark, obsidian eyes meeting Elena's in the amber light. "You have her father's hair?" he asked quietly, his voice low and respectful. Elena let out a short, faint breath that was half a laugh and half a sigh. She looked down at Clara's dark curls, then shook her head slowly. "No," she said softly. "Her father was fair, golden-haired, with blue eyes that always looked past you, toward whatever horizon he hadn't crossed yet. She has my father's hair, dark as river stones." Silas nodded once, his expression solemn. A man who looks only at the horizon misses the ground where his feet are standing. He steps on the flowers without seeing them. The poetic truth of his words struck Elena with such precision that her throat tightened. "His name was Caleb," Elena said, the name tasting flat and lifeless on her tongue. She had not spoken it aloud to anyone since she found the note. But now, sitting by the fire with this man who had held her hands through the dark, the words came easily, without bitterness, as though she were recounting a story that belonged to someone else long ago. "We came from Ohio," she continued, her voice gaining a steady, quiet strength. 6 years ago, he told me there was silver in the Mogollon Hills. He told me we would build an empire of timber and stone, that our children would never know what it was to want for anything. I believed him. I packed everything my mother gave me and followed him across 2,000 miles of dust. She paused, watching a spark drift up into the chimney flue. He wasn't an evil man, Silas. He was just hollow, like a dry gourd. He had debts in town from the faro tables, and when the silver didn't jump out of the rock to meet him, he decided the mountain was his enemy. 11 days ago, I woke up, and the house was cold. He left a note by the salt jar on the table. 4 lines. He took our winter savings, he took our draft horse, and he rode off for California with a saloon girl from Silver City. Silas did not interrupt. He sat in that unbroken, listening silence that belongs only to men who understand the true weight of grief. His jaw tightened slightly, a shadow of fierce, righteous anger passing through his eyes, but his posture remained calm. "A man who leaves a woman with child in the winter has lost his spirit," Silas said, his English deliberate and heavy with the moral weight of his people. "Among the Chihen, such a man would be cast out from the camp. He would not be permitted to sit by the fire of the elders, for he has proven that his blood carries no honor." Elena looked at him, searching his face. "Tell me of your people, Silas. The townspeople speak of the Apache with fear. But you? You walked into this room and became my shelter." Silas looked down at the glowing embers of the hearth, his thoughts traveling miles to the south, across the rugged limestone canyons and geothermal springs where his ancestors had walked since the beginning of time. "My people are the Chihen," he said, the word rolling from his throat with pride. "The red paint people of the warm springs. We belong to these mountains. The rock knows our names. For generations, we lived where the water was sweet and the game was plentiful. But the soldiers came. They built forts at Bayard and Craig. They tell us the mountains belong to Washington now, that we must live behind fences on the agency land, where the flour is rotten and the water is sour." He raised his eyes, looking directly into hers. "I have spent my life navigating between two worlds that want to destroy each other. I have seen white soldiers burn our lodges in the winter. I have seen our women and children weep in the cold. 6 winters ago, my younger sister died of a fever in a freezing cave while we were fighting off cavalry patrols. I could not save her." He looked toward Clara, his voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in the room. "When I stood on the ridge last night, and I heard you cry through the storm, I heard my sister's voice. The Creator gave me a choice: to walk away as a warrior who protects only himself, or to step down into this valley and remember that all life comes from the same breath. I could not leave you, Elena. To leave you would be to let my sister die a second time." Tears spilled over Elena's lashes, hot and silent. She reached her free hand across the rug and placed it gently over his calloused knuckles. Silas did not pull away. His fingers turned upward, closing around hers with a warm, steady pressure that felt like the solid earth beneath the snow. For a long moment, the warmth of the hearth and the quiet communion of their shared grief wrapped around them like a sanctuary. Then, the mountain made its presence known once more. Silas rose to his feet, his tall frame blocking the golden sunlight as he stepped to the frosted window. He used the palm of his hand to wipe away a circle of thick white ice from the glass, looking out across the yard. The sight that met his eyes was one of breathtaking, terrifying grandeur. The morning light had set the high peaks of the Sangre de Cristo and the Mogollon Range ablaze in shades of molten gold, crimson, and pale violet. The sky was an impossible, crystalline blue, so sharp and pure that it looked like polished glass. Yet below that magnificent sky lay a lethal white prison. The blizzard had dumped nearly 4 feet of fresh powder across the valley, and the howling winds had sculpted massive, 6-foot drifts that sealed the cabin from the outside like an iron vault. The trail leading down toward the canyon pass was completely obliterated. Every boulder, every ravine, and every familiar landmark was buried beneath an ocean of freezing snow. Silas turned back toward the room, his scout's mind instantly calculating the brutal arithmetic of their situation. Elena was still sitting by the hearth, but her face had turned a shade paler. As she attempted to shift her position to adjust the blanket over Clara, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her lower abdomen, and her brow furrowed in sudden pain. Silas was beside her in 2 strides, his dark eyes instantly taking in the small, dark, crimson stain that had begun to seep through the edge of the clean flannel beneath her hips. Her body had not fully sealed itself after the birth. She was hemorrhaging slightly, not a violent gush, but a slow, continuous weeping of blood that was draining what little strength she had left. Her skin was clammy to the touch, and when Silas pressed 2 fingers against the pulse point at the side of her throat, her heartbeat was rapid, shallow, and faint. He looked toward the pantry shelves. There was half a cup of coarse cornmeal in a jar, a scraping of salted lard at the bottom of a wooden firkin, and a handful of dry pinto beans. There was no fresh meat. There was no medicine, no willow bark for the pain, no dried goldenrod to stem the bleeding, and no nourishing broth to rebuild the blood she had lost during the night. The firewood he had stacked by the hearth would last 36 hours, perhaps 48 if they rationed it until the room grew bitter cold. Elena could not walk. She could not sit a horse. To attempt to move her through 4 feet of snow in her condition would kill her before they reached the bottom of the draw. The truth stood between them in the firelit room, stark, unyielding, and terrifying. They were warm for this morning. They had survived the birth. But without clean bandages, without proper medicine to stop her bleeding, and without food to sustain a nursing mother, Elena Vance and her newborn daughter would freeze or starve to death in this cabin within 2 days. Elena looked up at Silas, reading the grim, unmistakable calculation in the set of his jaw. She looked down at Clara, who was sleeping peacefully against her chest, entirely unaware of the cold shadow hanging over their heads. "Silas," Elena whispered, her voice trembling with the first cold touch of dread. "What are we going to do?" Silas looked from the dying provisions to the mountain peaks glowing in the dawn, then back down to the woman and child who had been placed in his care. His decision was already made. Silas stood before the hearth, looking down at Elena and the fragile, sleeping life in her arms. The morning sun was climbing higher, turning the vast snowfields outside into a blinding sea of white diamonds. But inside the small room, the shadows were lengthening. He knelt beside her once more, his tall frame folding with that quiet, deliberate grace that Elena had come to recognize as the hallmark of his strength. He looked into her fever-bright hazel eyes, his face set in lines of unshakable resolve. "There is only one path," Silas said, his deep voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had already measured the cost and accepted it. "You cannot walk through the snow, Elena. If you stay here, without medicine to stop the bleeding, without food to give you strength, the cold will take you both before 2 suns have set. I must go down the mountain. I will bring the town doctor and the women of San Rafael back with a wagon." Elena's breath hitched in her throat, her eyes widening in sudden, paralyzing terror. Her hand shot out, grasping his forearm, her fingers tightening with frantic urgency. "No," she choked out, her voice trembling. "No, Silas, you can't. You don't know what they are like down there. San Rafael is not a place for an Apache man. They have a vigilance committee. Men like Harlan Ramsey carry rifles on the street, looking for any excuse. If you walk into that town, they will shoot you before you even reach the porch of the livery barn. They will hang you from the nearest tree." Silas did not flinch. He placed his warm, calloused palm over her trembling fingers, looking into her eyes with an intensity that seemed to reach straight into her soul. "I know what white men do when they are afraid," he said softly. "I have known their fear my entire life. But fear is a blind creature, Elena. It can be made to see if a man knows how to stand before it. Sheriff Foster is a man who saw the war in the East. He knows what blood costs. If I reach him, he will listen to the truth. And if you don't reach him?" Elena's voice broke, tears spilling freely down her pale cheeks. "What if they don't let you speak? You saved my life, Silas. You brought my baby into this world with your own hands. I cannot let you walk to your death for us." "A warrior does not measure his duty by what is safe," Silas replied, his voice dropping to a low, melodic murmur that felt like a sacred vow. "The Creator did not lead me through the blizzard to leave you to die in the morning light. My life was spared in the storm, so that yours might continue. That is the only purpose that matters now." He gently eased her fingers from his arm and stood up to prepare the cabin for his absence. Moving with swift, practiced precision, Silas stacked the heavy oak and cedar logs deep into the stone fireplace, arranging them in a self-feeding pyramid that would burn slowly, casting an even, long-lasting bed of radiant coals for hours. He hauled the heavy iron kettle, steaming with melted snow, and placed it on the hearthstone within Elena's arm's reach, along with a clean tin cup. He gathered the remaining woolen blankets and Caleb's heavy buffalo robe, draping them over Elena and tucking the edges securely around her shoulders and feet, creating a warm, insulated nest against the rising stone of the chimney. Then, he did something that stopped Elena's breath entirely. Silas walked to the corner by the front door where he had set down his Springfield carbine. He lifted the heavy rifle, checked the breech, and walked back to the hearth. Kneeling beside Elena, he laid the military rifle gently across the wool blanket at her right side, placing a small tin of brass cartridges beside her hand. "Keep this beside you," Silas said quietly. "If the door opens, and it is not my voice, you cock the hammer, and you defend your child." Elena stared down at the dark steel of the weapon, then looked up at him in shock. "You're leaving your rifle here? Silas, you cannot walk into that valley unarmed. You will have no way to defend yourself." Silas shook his head slowly, a faint, sad smile touching the corners of his lips. "If I walk into San Rafael carrying a rifle, their fear will make the decision for them. They will see only a gun, and they will fire without thinking. But if I walk down the center of their street with my hands open and empty, they will be forced to look upon my face. They will have to see a man before they see an enemy. My empty hands will be my armor, Elena." He reached down one last time, extending his index finger to gently touch baby Clara's forehead, whispering a soft, rhythmic blessing in the ancient tongue of the Chihen Apache, a prayer asking the spirits of the mountain and the four winds to watch over the child until his return. Then he looked into Elena's eyes. For 5 long, breathless seconds, their gazes locked across the warm amber light of the hearth. In that silent exchange, everything that could not be spoken in words, gratitude, sorrow, rising devotion, and the fierce, unshakable bond forged in the crucible of the night, passed between them like an electric current. "Keep the fire burning," Silas whispered. "I will return before the sun touches the western ridge." "Silas," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her hand reaching out to brush against the fringe of his sleeve. "Come back to us. Please, come back." "I will," he said. Silas turned, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. He lifted the heavy iron latch, threw his broad shoulder against the cedar planks, and shoved the door open against the 6-foot snowdrift outside. A sudden swirl of crystalline white powder and freezing mountain air rushed into the entryway, catching the fringe of his buckskin shirt. Silas stepped over the threshold, pulling the heavy door shut behind him until the iron latch dropped back into its slot with a solid, echoing thud that resonated through the silent room. Inside, the cabin was suddenly still. Elena gritted her teeth against the dull, throbbing ache in her lower body, using every ounce of her remaining strength to pull herself upward onto her knees. Clutching baby Clara tightly against her chest inside the fleece-lined coat, she dragged herself the few feet across the braided rug to the frost-covered window. She raised her trembling hand, pressing her sleeve against the glass, wiping away the circle of white ice until the blinding, sunlit expanse of the Mogollon Range opened before her eyes. Through the clear pane, she watched him go. Silas was walking down the center of the unbroken white draw, his tall, powerful silhouette carved starkly against the towering snowbanks and the deep green of the ponderosa pines. He wore no hat, his long black hair catching the morning breeze, his arms hanging relaxed at his sides, his empty hands open and visible against the glare of the snow. With every long, deliberate stride, he plowed through waist-deep drifts, carving a solitary dark furrow through the frozen wilderness, heading directly down the mountain toward a town that despised his people, toward a street lined with loaded rifles, toward the lion's den of San Rafael. Elena pressed her forehead against the cold glass, tears falling hot and fast onto Clara's sleeping face. "Lord of heaven and earth," she whispered into the frosty glass, her voice shaking with all the desperate love of a mother and the fierce devotion of a woman whose heart had been resurrected from the ashes. "Watch over him. Keep his feet upon the rock. Soften the hearts of the men in that valley, and bring him back to this hearth alive." She watched until the tall, solitary figure of the Apache warrior grew small in the distance, disappearing beneath the shadow of the lower canyon pines, leaving behind only the deep, straight trail of his footprints in the snow, a crimson path of courage, leading straight into the unknown. And that, my dear friends, brings us to the end of part 1 of the Embers of Mogollon. What a journey we have walked together tonight. We have seen a young woman pushed to the very brink of despair, betrayed by the man who swore to protect her, and we have witnessed the staggering, selfless courage of Silas, a man who had every reason in the world to keep walking through the blizzard, yet chose to stop, to kneel by a dying fire, and to offer his hands to bring a new life into the light. Now, the stage is set for an even greater trial. As Silas walks down the mountain into the hostile frontier settlement of San Rafael, with his hands deliberately empty, he is walking straight into the crosshairs of a town, drowning in prejudice and fear. Will Sheriff Samuel Foster have the wisdom and the backbone to listen to the truth, or will men like Harlan Ramsey pull their triggers before the first word of mercy can be spoken? And how long can Elena and little Clara hold on in that isolated cabin as the fever rises and the hours slip away? We will find the answers to all of these questions in part 2. The Lion's Den and the Shadowed Room, which will be coming your way very soon. You will not want to miss a single minute of the tension, the courage, and the deep, blossoming love that is about to unfold. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Take a moment right now and leave a comment below. Tell me, what did you think of Silas's decision to leave his rifle behind and walk into that town unarmed. And please, let me know where you are listening from tonight. Which state, city, or corner of this beautiful world are you tuning in from? I read every single one of your comments, and our growing community here at Eagle Eye Apache is built on the stories and the warmth that we share together around this digital campfire. If this story touched your heart tonight, please take a second to hit that like button. Share this video with your family, your friends, and anyone who loves the enduring spirit of the American frontier and the power of true, courageous love. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode when the next chapter drops. Until next time, my friends, take care of yourselves, look out for one another, and always remember to keep the fire burning in your own hearth. Good night.